First thing, I want to celebrate the fact that the Trust Show podcast has been on the air for 3 years as of last week. It now has 149 episodes, including today's episode, and I would estimate that it has over 120 hours of content, and it's all free and available to you. Now to today's episode. There is a question that I'm often asked, and that's, what is trust? Well, I answered this question in the Book of Trust, and even in the mini Book of Trust, and also in this podcast, although it was about 3 years ago when I started this podcast. And oddly enough, or maybe not oddly enough, my definition of trust, which I finalized some 4 years ago with the first edition of the Book of Trust, has not changed. But it's probably appropriate to repeat it, mainly because I keep getting asked, so what is your definition of trust? What is trust? And maybe explain it a little better now. In this episode, I will give you my definition for trust, why we need trust, and some findings from my most recent trust research. Right after this. Welcome to the Trust Show. I'm Yoram Solomon, your host, the author of the Book of Trust, and facilitator of the Trust Habits Workshop. My mission is simple. I want to help you form habits that build your trustworthiness, because the answer to this question will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? When I started my work on trust, I started by looking at definitions, dictionary definitions for the word trust. And the dictionary definitions are almost worthless. I mean, it's for people who really don't really know what the word trust even mean. Then I started reading every book about trust, and I need to have a disclaimer here, and that's having the word trust in the title of the book and maybe in every other page doesn't make it a book about trust. And unfortunately, I came across a few books that were supposedly about trust, but really weren't. I read every significant article about trust. I ended up with my own definition. But before I go into the definition, I want to talk about why we need trust. And here's something that I do in my workshops and even in my keynotes. I describe why we need trust. So I'm going to start with, you're probably familiar with the phrase, no risk, no reward, right? What does it mean? It means that if you want to get a certain reward, there's typically a risk associated with it. So you want to gain something, and most likely you may lose something. Sometimes the certainty of losing something is pretty high in order for you to gain whatever it is you want to gain. But typically it's you want to gain something and there is a risk that you're going to lose something. Think about going to the casino, okay? When you go to the casino, why do you gamble? You gamble because you look at the reward that you can get, right? Which is money. But there is a risk, and the risk is that you lose the money that you came with. So the reward is you're going to get money that you did not come with. The risk is that you're going to lose money that you did come with. So we typically start with wanting a reward. There's a reward up there, and we want to get that reward. And unfortunately, there's risk associated with it. Now, I have to distinguish two terms here, and that's risk and fear. Those are related, but not the same. Risk is objective, fear is subjective. Risk, if, for example, let's go back to the casino example. If I'm going to the casino with $1,000 and I'm going to spend $1,000 on chips, on slot machines, or anything, what is the risk to me? The risk is that I lose $1,000. That's the risk. It's very objective. I came with 1,000, I'm going to lose 1,000. And I'm not assuming that I'm going to put more money. I'm limited to 1,000. How about you? What is the risk to you if you go to the casino with $1,000? Well, the risk is exactly the same. Again, because risk is objective. The risk for you is to lose $1,000. But what if my bank account has $10,000 total and your bank account has $1 million total? My fear of losing $1,000 out of the $10,000 that I have is much bigger than the fear that you have of losing the same $1,000, but for you it's out of $1 million. So the risk is objective, and it's the same for both of us if the risk is the same for both of us, but the fear is different. And whenever I talk about risk, I actually am talking about fear, but I am still going to use the word risk. Okay, so I'm just going to look at risk as subjective, but really, again, refer to fear. So if I'm going to look for a certain reward, it comes with a certain risk or fear, both actually. Will I take this risk? This is where we go into the risk tolerance bar, and we have different risk tolerance bar or fear tolerance bar. And for some people are more risk taker, which means that the bar for them is higher. Some people are less risk tolerant, which means the bar for them is lower. And the thing is, if you're about to take a risk that is above your risk tolerance bar, you feel danger. We don't like feeling danger. But if the risk that you're about to take comes below your risk tolerance bar, then you feel safety. You know, what's the worst that can happen? I'm willing to take this because it's below my risk tolerance bar. So, the risk tolerance bar is what distinguishes the risk that we're willing to take from the risk that we're not willing to take. But what happens when the reward that we are seeking is high enough to create a risk, a potential risk? Well, risk is potential by definition for potential loss that goes above our risk tolerance bar. What can we do? And this is where trust comes in. What we can do is trust someone to bridge that gap, that risk gap, to take us from the level of risk that we're not willing to take to a level of risk that we are willing to take, simply because we trust them to bridge that gap. So this is my definition of why trust is important and where trust plays a role, and why do we need trust? We need trust to bridge the gap between the risk that we're about to take to get a certain reward to go below our risk tolerance bar. Now, I did some research recently, and part of it was to distinguish or determine whether we are risk takers. How are we on risk taking in general? That study took 426 participants. It was done in May of 2024, so this month, if you're listening to the podcast when it's released, of which 219 were women, 206 were men. And yes, if you add 219 and 206, you don't get 426, you get 425. One of them was non-binary, and I just didn't allocate it to the group of women or men to determine gender preferences. A group of one is just too small. So one of the questions that I asked is, to what degree do you agree or disagree with the following statement? I feel comfortable taking risks. Now, I have to admit that I expect people to be much less of risk takers than I found. What I found was that 8% strongly disagreed that they feel comfortable taking risks. 8% generally disagreed. 14% somewhat disagreed. So total disagreement was 30%. Then 23% were neutral. to whether they feel comfortable taking risk or not. 26% were somewhat in agreement, 11% generally agreed, 10% strongly agreed. So a total of 48% actually said yes, that they agree, that they feel comfortable taking risk. However, because there's 26% that only somewhat agreed to that, one thing that I do with this survey, as you can see, it's a 7-point scale, and point number 4 is neutral. I look at it as a narrow neutral, so those who specifically said neutral, and then as a wide neutral, and in that I include those who said, I somewhat disagree, I somewhat agree, and now we had a very broad middle, a very broad neutral of 63%. And so only 21% said generally or strongly they agree that they feel comfortable taking risk. 16% said that they generally or strongly disagree. But overall, in both cases, we still see some, even if it's a small, preference towards we are taking risk. I then wanted to see if there is a gender difference here, and I actually did find a significant gender difference. Who do you think is more of a risk taker, men or women? Now, I could now tease you and say, I'll remind you that last week when I shared who feels more strongly that you get what you paid for, I thought it was going to be women. It was actually men. But this time it was exactly what you would think that it is. So gender-wise, men said 53%, or 53% of men said, yes, I feel comfortable taking risks, compared to 42% of women. 35% of women said, no, we don't feel comfortable taking risks, compared to 24%. So there is an 11% difference in both ends. Men are 11% more willing to take risk. Women are 11% less willing to take risk. And the neutral was pretty similar. But that is a significant difference between men and women. Then I looked at age. Do you think that there is a difference between, my survey was limited to the age range of 18 to 65. Which one do you think is more willing to take risk, or is there a difference? And I found the difference. I found a pretty significant difference. And it was that at the age of 18, on average, they ranked 5 out of 7. So they put it on very close to 5, which is, I somewhat agree that I feel comfortable taking risk. At the age of 65, it was only 3.5. So it's between neutral and somewhat disagreed that I feel comfortable taking risks. So that's pretty significant. First of all, it's on the opposite side of the neutral. So at the age of 18, we're more willing to take risk than at the age of 65. And again, it's a pretty significant impact. I mean, if I did that percentage-wise, we are actually 42, almost 43% more willing to take risk when we're 18 compared to when we're 65. And by the way, I found a very strong statistical significance to that difference, to that correlation between age and willingness to take risk. So not only that it was a very significant correlation, but it was also statistically significant, which means that it can be used to predict. So let me go to the definition of trust. And I'm going to use my definition. Again, I read a lot of books, a lot of articles, a lot of definitions, and came up with my definition, which is, trust is your willingness to accept the negative consequences of giving control over something you have to another person/thing, expecting them to do their best to minimize those possibilities or consequences. Negative consequences, that is. Let me first read it again, and then I'm going to unpack it. Trust is your willingness to accept the negative consequences of giving control over something you have to another person or thing, expecting them to do their best to minimize those possibilities for negative consequences. Let's unpack it. Let's break it down. First, it's your willingness, which means that trust is not a mandatory thing. You don't have to trust. You don't find yourself in a position that you have to trust. I'm assuming you always have the ability or the willingness or the decision power to decide that you're going to trust. You may not have other options, but it's still your decision. Trust is a conscious decision that we make. That's your willingness. There are potential negative consequences which you're willing to accept. The negative consequences are objectively the risk that's associated with the reward. More practically or more accurately, it's your fear of that risk, which we've already established can be different to other people. So when you trust, first, there are potential negative consequences. Second, there is a willingness to accept them if they happen. Of course, you're trusting that they're not going to happen, but we'll get there. The next part is that the consequences are consequences of giving control over something you have. So what is that thing that you have? It could be money. The casino, you're giving control over your money, your $1,000. Who are you giving it to? You're giving it to the casino, to the slot machine, to the poker table person, the dealer. Could be time. You could be losing time. You're risking time. Could be your job security. If I trust you to do something that I need for my job, I'm actually risking my job security. I'm giving you control over my job security. It could be as far as your life. I mean, whenever you board a plane, you're giving control over your life to the pilots, to the manufacturers of the airplane, to the company that maintains it, and so on and so forth. So to trust means that you are giving control over something that you have, that you controlled up until now. You controlled your money, you controlled your time, you controlled your job security, you controlled your life. And now you're giving control over that. You're doing it to another person or thing. That brings the question, who do we trust? And I believe that we trust, we can say 3 or 4 different entities. One is ourselves. We can trust ourselves. Now, I'm going to say that trusting myself, I don't know that I would separate that from where is my risk tolerance bar. Because typically, the more I trust myself, the higher my risk tolerance bar is, because it's risks outside of what I can control myself, out of what I can do myself by trusting myself. But I'm still going to keep it. So to another person, and plus in my definition, I'm talking about another person, not to yourself. It's not about trusting yourself. Trusting yourself is just a matter of where you put the risk or fear tolerance bar. You may trust God. And actually, in one of the future episodes, I'm going to talk to a man of God. He is I don't know how to define him, but he's a good friend of mine, and he's really a man of God. And we will talk about trusting God with him. And then there's 2 other people. And the reason I say it's 3 or 4 different entities is because I look at 2 types of other people. Other people that we know. This is typically a direct first-hand impression of another person, whether you knew them before or not, and you just got to know them. But this is someone that you're trusting, and you know them. But then there's other people who you don't know. So take, for example, once again, you're getting on that plane. You trust the pilot. You know who the pilot is? I mean, you probably heard their name when the flight attendant said their name, and you probably remember their name for at least 5 seconds after she said that, and now you don't remember their name anymore. So do you really know the pilot? Because you are putting your hands at your life at the hands of the pilot. Well, We may argue you saw the pilot get on the plane. You formed a first impression. How about the people who filled fuel, Jet A fuel, into the plane? You trust them, right? Did you see them do that? Do you know who they are? Do you know their names? The people who built the plane, maintained the plane. There are a lot of people here that you're trusting, whether you like it or not, that you don't know. So how come you trust them? That goes into trust law number 5. Trust is or could be transferable. You trust them because you trust someone you do know, like the airline. So you trust the airline, you know the airline. Based on that, you trust other people. But you may be trusting another person. So you're giving control over something you have to another person or thing. And when I say thing, the airplane, you're trusting the airplane, but the airplane is really a proxy for the people who built it, maintained it, and so on. And the last part that's important, that was, by the way, the last part that I added to my definition, is that you are expecting them to do their best to minimize the possibility of the negative consequences. So trusting someone is not just giving them control, but it's giving them control, expecting them to lower the risk and bridge that gap between the actual risk that you're taking or your fear of that risk and your risk tolerance bar. Now, I say that you're expecting them to do their best, but maybe it's not their best. Maybe it's just whatever it takes to minimize the possibility of the consequences, to get you to below your risk or fear tolerance bar. Maybe it's not their best. Maybe they don't need to exercise their best to get you there. Then there are several questions. One of them is, do they have the capacity or the capability to do that? I mean, for you to expect them to reduce that trust, when you trust the pilot and you expect the pilot to reduce the risk to your life by him or her not knowing how to fly that plane, do they have the capacity to do that, the capability to do that? They have to have that capacity or capability, but they also have to have the willingness. They have to have the willingness to do that. And I'm adding one more component, and that is they have to have the knowledge that you rely on them. Now, did the pilot board the plane and first went through the airplane and asking, are you trusting me with your life? Are you trusting me with your life? Are you trusting me with your life to all the passengers? No, they didn't. But they still know that the passengers do trust them with their lives. When they make decisions, life or death decisions, they have to know that passengers' lives depend on it and that the passengers do expect them to minimize that risk. So there's the knowledge. So when you expect them to do their best or to do whatever it takes to minimize the possibility or for negative consequences, you're also trusting that they have the capacity or capability to do that, the willingness to do that, and the knowledge that you're relying on them. One more thing that I would add again is that when I talk about trust, and I said that trust is your willingness, I want to remind you of trust law number 1, and that's that trust is continuous. It's a degree. And so my definition actually is that the level of trust that you have in another person is the degree of your willingness or the degree to which you're willing to accept the negative consequences of giving control over something you have to another person or thing, expecting them to do their best to minimize those possibilities or consequences. So that's my definition of trust. There has been a lot of research done on who do we trust the most, who do we trust the least. But I asked in my survey a general question that is, do you think people are trusted? Or my specific question was, to what degree do you agree or disagree with the following statement? People can generally be trusted. That's it. People can generally be trusted. Do you agree or disagree with that? Again, I'm going to say that I was a little surprised. I expected to get more of a disillusioned, pessimistic approach that says Generally, we think people cannot be trusted, but actually what I got was pretty fairly even. I got 9% said they strongly disagreed that people can generally be trusted. 10% generally disagreed. 16% somewhat disagreed. So total of those who had the word disagree there was 36%. 36% said that we somewhat generally or strongly disagree with the statement people can generally be trusted. 23% were neutral, which is pretty broad, again. And I should say that the halfway point is right there in neutral, and or the median is in neutral. And then 24% said somewhat agree that people generally can be trusted. 12% said they generally agree with that statement, and 5%, only 5%, said they strongly agree that people can generally be trusted. That puts the total at 42% said yes. They somewhat agree generally or strongly agree that people generally can be trusted, and 35% said no. They disagree somewhat generally or strongly disagree that people generally can be trusted. And again, the median was in neutral, mainly because they're 23%, so not a big difference. When I compared men versus women, I did see, again, significant differences. Whereas it was 42% who said, yes, people can be trusted generally, it was 46% of men. So men are more trusting than women. 46% of men said yes, 37% of women said yes. But here is an interesting thing. When it came to no, I don't agree that people can generally be trusted, men actually said no more than women. So men, I would say, were more decisive on whether men or women can be trusted, whereas women had a much bigger medium or neutral, 28%. 28% of women said we're neutral on this versus only 18% of men, and on average, 23%. So, but in general, I would say that men were more trusting than women. Now, as far as age, I found very little difference in my survey of 426 participants, and it was not statistically significant enough, the correlation between them. But Pew Research, back in 2019, did a study. They wanted to see if there is an age difference, and they did find an age difference. And I'm going to read to you one thing that I found from one of their surveys in 2019. And the title of that article where they published the survey was that young Americans are less trusting of other people and key institutions than their elders. The statement that was posed to them was kind of the opposite of my statement. My statement was people can generally be trusted. Their statement was most people cannot be trusted. And 60% of those ages 18 to 29 agreed with that statement versus only 29% of people aged 65 and above. So it was double. It was double the number of people at the age 65 who disagreed with the statement that people cannot be trusted. So it's a double negative. So in other words, they agree that people can be trusted versus 60% of 18 to 29 or the millennials who agreed that people cannot be trusted, or in other words, disagreed that people can be trusted. It is time to summarize, and I'll start with my definition of trust. Trust is your willingness to accept the possible negative consequences of giving control over something you have to another person or thing, expecting them to do what it takes to reduce that possibility and consequences. We trust. Why do we trust? We trust because we want a reward, and the reward comes with risk. We are afraid of that risk more than our acceptable risk or fear tolerance bar. And we need to trust someone to bridge our fear to a level that we are willing to take, a more manageable level. Risk is relative. Risk is also continuous. So it's not that I trust or I don't trust. It's how much do I trust. It's the degree to which I'm willing to accept those consequences. And, when I try to, in my research, to find out if we are risk takers or not, we're somewhere in the middle. Men are more risk takers than women. Shouldn't be a surprise. Young people are more risk takers than old people. That shouldn't be a surprise. And finally, we feel that people generally can be trusted, but, it's not strongly. The median is still neutral. Men are a little more trusting than women, but also men are more definitive on whether they trust or not compared to women. That's it for today. I hope this made you think a little differently about trust. May trust be with you. This was The Trust Show. What would you like to know about trust and trustworthiness? Let me know and I'll answer it in a future episode. I would love to hear from you. Email me at yoram@thetrustshow.com. If you like this episode, subscribe to the show so you will automatically get notified when I release a new episode. Rate it. Write a review for this podcast because those ratings help not only you, but also others looking for podcasts just like this. If you're looking for more resources to learn about how to build trust, be trusted, or know who to trust, look up my workshops, online courses, books, or go to my website, trusthabits.com. And remember that the answer to these two questions will have the biggest impact on your personal and professional success or failure. Can I trust you? And can you trust me? Thank you for listening or watching The Trust Show.